and I began by asking him if he was worried about the rise of far-right, pro-Putin politicians in Europe after Geert Wilders' win in the Netherlands.
I'm absolutely worried about that. But to be honest, I think that's got less to do with Putin and more to do with us. On the specifics of Ukraine, I think it's very important now, after what I regard as an extraordinarily positive time where we have demonstrated that the West, the thing that was supposed to be in decline, can get its act together. Where I think Putin's received a huge downside surprise about the resilience and coherence of our society. There is something about being able to follow through on a time frame now that it's obvious that this is going to be a long struggle. But that's about us, and actually it's also about our leadership formulating a clear strategy, a political strategy for Ukraine.
And
we've got to start talking about that.
We certainly do, because it doesn't go on forever. We've had Giorgia Meloni talking about tiredness on all sides in the West about Ukraine. And clearly one of the things that Putin wants is to see whether we lose attention, lose focus. And
you've got this group of recalcitrants in Congress who, for very self-interest reasons, are blocking aid. So this is all a worry. As I say, it shouldn't obscure the extraordinary achievement jointly with the Ukrainians that there has been so far. But I think this is about us formulating and explaining why we're in the fight with Ukraine and what we want the end game to be. And we've got to start talking about that. And the end game is to thwart Putin's ambition to absorb Ukraine into the eastern sphere of influence. The more westernized we can make it, the more resilient we can make Ukraine, the closer the path to European Union membership, the higher the quality of the security guarantees. All these things make Ukraine fundamentally indigestible to Russia, pretty well regardless of where the war ends.
So that's more important than the exact border.
Yes, winning the war, winning the peace is more important than the military aspects of this. Is why we're doing this.
So we've talked a bit about Russia, and I read something you said a little while ago when you were talking about cyber attacks, and you said a rule of thumb was that if the target was political, the culprit was Russia. If the target was economic, the culprit was China. But that is changing.
Yes, but it in gradation. So that the Chinese sort of target set has expanded to include all aspects of international that might impact on the Chinese Communist Party's monopoly of power. So anything that represents a challenge to that is now fair game. I think to an extent they're also becoming strategic actors. They're building up a nuclear arsenal. They are now they aspire to be peer adversaries to the West. But my rule of thumb is still in quite good nick, I would say.
Quite good nick. And we've had the Intelligence and Security Committee in the House of Commons say that China has now penetrated every aspect of the British economy. Do you think there was a period of naivety, perhaps around a decade ago, when it was meant to be the golden age of our relationship with China, and we had Xi Jinping pulling pints in an Oxfordshire pub and all of that? Was that naive?
Yes.
And so we've now got one of the authors of that, of course, as Foreign Secretary, and there have been criticisms of his relationship with the Chinese, particularly over the port in Colombo in Sri Lanka and some of the things he said around then. What would be your advice to him?
No, just like you, I imagine you've changed these past 10 years. I certainly have. It was a different time. So I would imagine, I haven't discussed it with him, that his views will now be very different. And that's not a sign of inconsistency. The world has moved on. My vantage point is different, Andrew. I'm brought up in the covert world. History never ended in the covert world. It wasn't axiomatic to us that democracy had won. Our enemies definitely didn't get the memo. We've been on the front line of a sort of ideological confrontation more or less since the beginning of this century. So I think it's sort of overstating it that there was a sort of widespread buy-in to the idea that China would become more like us as it got rich. I don't think that's true. And by the way, Xi Jinping is very keen that it isn't true.
No, he certainly wants to hang on to that power. But we do have, there's an argument going on in politics about what our relationship should be with China. Should it be a competitor? The Chinese say, ho, 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 we're no longer competitors with you people. Or should it be an adversary, an opponent or whatever? Do you think we're in an age where we have to turn our back on this idea that China is just another big country with whom we have to get on?
Well, can I come up with a controversial proposition?
Please.
We should actually have a policy that allows us to vary our approach to China. My big criticism of the current debate is it's black and white, binary, 1 or 0. And China is a very good point. In some areas, we should compete with them. Where we see them playing with our democracy or our national security, we can test that. We can test it. In other areas, particularly when it comes to mastery of emerging technology, let us understand that whoever gets there first is going to be in a pretty unassailable position. We need to compete like hell in that area. And in other areas, we need to cooperate. China is a huge fact. It's one planet, two systems. We need to be able to work together on pandemic disease, global warming, how the global economy works, all of that stuff. That's a conversation. In your personal life, I'm sure you have lots of relationships where you can test, compete, and cooperate. I don't understand why we find that so hard to do at a strategic level.
It may be called marriage, I'm not sure.
I wasn't going to say that.
We're hopping around the world here, but let me turn to the awful events in Gaza. As a security guy, were you surprised by the fact that Mossad did not apparently know what was going to happen?
Well, can I just return to our earlier theme? When you look, I am extremely suspicious of anyone when talking about this appalling tragedy who claims that it's black or white. You have to be able to understand a set of different facts at the same time. And by the way, they're not in tension with each other, but you would think they were from the discourse. There are two that guide my approach. One, Israel has a right to defend itself. This was a horrific massacre. How could anyone imagine that they could take that lying down? It's nuts. Two, the crimes of Hamas are not the crimes of the Palestinian people. And furthermore, you should understand terrorism, and I did it for 10 years, so I know, to be not about the action, but the reaction. The reaction that Hamas sets out to provoke is one that is seen as disproportionate, and you need to be very, very careful not to read from their script. So I think as we now look at phase 2, operations in southern Gaza, it's really important, I think, essentially for Israel, notwithstanding their right to defend themselves, to understand that fundamentally this isn't a military struggle, it's a political one.
Which we haven't really seen so far. So I wondered whether the savagery and the brutality and the extreme nature of the original attack was entirely designed to produce a hugely disproportionate response, which would then produce the next generation of Hamas terrorists.
Look, as a matter of generality, and as I say, this is a thing I know about, that's what terrorism seeks to do. And the more appalling repellent the act, the happier they are, because the more likely it is in turn that we will be provoked. Terrorists are ultimately, remember, trying to make us more like them. I think, just to answer your earlier question, though, Hamas didn't know how successful they were going to be, because no one would have anticipated that Israel wouldn't pick up on this more quickly, and as a result, the damage they were able to do was I think, probably compounded by an order of magnitude, just because of the amount of time they were able to spend on the ground undisturbed.
Yes.
That's what turned this from an appalling attack into a massacre.
Yes. And is your contention now, therefore, that for Israel, the era of kind of mass missile attacks and mass bombing should end, and that any military operation should be a much more sort of traditional men on the ground kind of thing to root out?
No, I wouldn't want to generalise, but what I do know, for two things. First of all, they have got to start talking about the political strategy. How do I know that matters? Because it's the reason we failed in Afghanistan. We pursued an exclusively military strategy in Afghanistan. It failed because we did not have a political strategy. They need, however hard it is, to start talking about the end state for Gaza. And the reason that's hard, Andrew, is because that links directly to some form of conversation about a settlement between Palestine and Israel.
Lead straight back to the West Bank.
And then you're back to there. But if you don't go there, I can tell you, as a practitioner, you will not engineer not even just a lasting solution, but even a close-in solution. That has to happen. But within that, there are a set of, I think, proportionate, targeted military activities led by intelligence and properly communicated as such that are entirely legitimate. And don't forget, under this, we've got this appalling human tragedy of the hostages, which is another source of complexity and probably also argue for taking a more nuanced approach. And by the way, I think that is broadly what's going to happen.
So intelligence-based fighting, not a ceasefire?
Well, I think this is another term that's got hijacked in the political debate, so I hesitate to wade in there. I think in practice, the military, the objectives that Netanyahu set out at the beginning, essentially to kill the whole Hamas leadership, are impractical in this. You would need so much violence to do that you would make the situation immeasurably worse. But they will have a set of military objectives, which I think are entirely justified to destroy the terrorist infrastructure and degrade the Hamas military capability and leadership. Those would be conventional military objectives when running a counterterrorism campaign. So I'd hesitate to say they just can't do that. That seems to me just unrealistic. But I think they really need to do it in a political context and understand the broader consequences and the need not to read from the script written by Hamas.
Taking some of this back to the streets of Britain, and I know you're not the streets of Britain guy, and nevertheless, we've seen really aggressive demonstrations outside the offices of MPs and on the streets. And we have seen Iranian flags there as well. And there's been a big debate, as you know, obviously, about the influence of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in this country, whether they should be proscribed, etc. But do you think the Iranians are trying to stir things up around Palestine in this country?
Yeah, I'm sure. Yes. I think, though, also that, I've discovered terrorism domestically. It's not my area, but it is a very subtle phenomenon. There will be a whole range of factors in operation. And I think people who are experiencing this, young people, are going to be confused and disorientated. And I worry, frankly, about the levels of radicalisation that this is driving. Indeed, I know it is driving high levels of radicalisation. So that's not so much about now, but it's about 3 or 4 years' time and the threats we might face as a result of this. So I think this does require mature, deft, patient and considered political leadership when we talk about this, basically designed to take the heat out of what we see in front of us.
But we could be seeing Iranian agents here, on these protests, stirring all of this up.
Well, my counterparts in MI5, my former colleagues, have been vocal in the past about the extent of the infrastructure run by the Revolutionary Guard or whoever else it might be. I don't think we should be complacent about it. I should say, though, in practice, most Iranian security and intelligence activity is aimed at their own dissidents, a bit like, as we were discussing,
Chinese.
China. So I wouldn't want... It's not a thing that I would like to... I don't want to leave you the idea that if you get rid of this problem, the heat will be taken out of this. But are the Iranians very satisfied with the polarization this is causing in our country and elsewhere? Undoubtedly, yes.